Now, we want to ask, all right, so is this argument, as we've got it down on the page here, is it a valid argument? And gosh, yes, it does seem to be a valid argument. If all the premises 1 through 3 are true, then the conclusion number 4 has to be true. And moreover, if we take 1 through 4 as premises and number 5 as a premise, if 1 through 5 are true, then 6 has got to be true as well. So it's a good argument. That's looking really nice for Descartes. But here's the rub. Even though it's a valid argument, it seems like it's not a very good argument. And the reason why is because if you notice, premise 1 is just the same thing as the conclusion that Descartes comes to in 4. He goes from assuming all things I clearly and distinctly perceive exist to concluding that all things I clearly and distinctly perceive exist. And so it's of course valid because, gosh, you can just forget about premises 2 and 3 as long as premise 1 is true. Then of course premise 4 has to be true because they're both the same thing. So a lot of philosophers have really worried that Descartes' reasoning here is what we call circular. That instead of going from some beliefs and coming up with new beliefs that must be true if all those old beliefs are true, you're really just starting out assuming that your conclusion is true from the start. And so that doesn't really build you up any new knowledge or new beliefs. It just gets you going around in circles. It just keeps you thinking the same thing you have been assuming to be true from the get-go. Of course, if you start out assuming that everything you clearly and distinctly perceive exists, then of course it has to be true that everything you clearly and distinctly perceive exists, but you haven't given any reason why you should believe that everything you clearly and distinctly perceive exists. And that's a big problem for Descartes. Because, of course, Descartes wants to make darn certain that he's not making any assumptions. He wants to be sure that every single belief he lets into his tower of knowledge, he can be absolutely certain he has good reason to believe is true. And a circular argument doesn't allow you to do that. Because all you've been doing all along, even though you add in a bunch of premises, you've just been assuming the truth of your conclusion all along. So this is a kind of the arguments that I gave you at the end of that deductive logic worksheet the other week, where I gave you some of these arguments and asked you if they're valid arguments and whether they're good arguments. And the answer for all of them was, well, yeah, they're technically valid, but they're circular arguments in just the same way that Descartes' argument is circular. So take a look at the second one here. My professor only speaks the truth. My professor says she only speaks the truth. Well, if those two things are true, then the conclusion has to be true that my professor only speaks the truth. But, of course, that conclusion is going to be true as long as just that first premise is true. You've just been assuming all along that your professor only speaks the truth. You haven't actually given us any good reason to think that your professor only speaks the truth. You could still doubt that conclusion just as much as you doubted it when you started off on the first premise. And the same thing goes for this argument about whether what the Bible says is true. So if Descartes' reasoning here is really circular, he started out with a really interesting problem, but then just kind of crashed and burned on the other side of it. Because at the end of that fourth meditation, he thinks he's almost certain that he can be certain now that not only does he exist as a thinking thing, but his beliefs about his body existing and space and time existing and the stars and planets and trees and chairs and tables existing, those can all be true because he clearly and distinctly perceives them, and God would never deceive him about those things. But it seems like in his argument for that, he's just been assuming that everything he clearly and distinctly perceives has got to be true. And that's going to be a problem. Now, there's lots of ways that lots of different philosophers throughout history have tried to patch up this argument and make it so that it's not circular and make it so that it really is a valid argument that doesn't run into this problem of circularity. But it's really tough. And that's kind of what I wanted to impress upon you by getting you to do some real philosophical work, some really difficult philosophical work, in reconstructing his argument. And you realize, gosh, it's not entirely clear what his reasoning is, and it's really difficult to construct that reasoning in a way that can allow him to come to this conclusion that these things that he clearly and distinctly perceives, that his body exists, that physical objects exist, that has to certainly be true. And so you kind of worry at the end of his fourth meditation, even though Descartes thinks he's solved his problem of epistemology and certainty, you might think, I don't think so, Descartes. So what we're going to do the next couple of weeks is go shopping around for some other theories for how you might come to get knowledge of the world. So we're going to move away from Descartes and Plato's rationalist view of how you build up knowledge and take a look at this empiricist theory that we're going to study Locke and Hume as examples of. So we'll see some new ways that you might try and build up your knowledge if you're still skeptical about whether Descartes has really accomplished his goal here.